Okay, welcome everyone. Let me first share my slides. All right. Well, this month, various of our speakers are talking about the continuity of consciousness, death and after. And Barend Voorham opened a series of lectures last week. And he presented a number of important core ideas that also form the basis of the cycle of life and death, the great adventure of the human soul in the heartbeat of the solar system, which we will discuss today. In order to be able to include everyone in tonight's lecture, we will briefly recap those basic ideas. However, if you have time and have not done so already, we absolutely recommend to watch the recording of last week's lecture as well. In the first part, we will talk about centers of consciousness, monads, that are on an eternal pilgrimage through the entire cosmos or universe. And in doing so, these monads pass through many transitional houses. In the second part, we will discuss the process of dying, the panoramic vision, and a realm of consciousness called Kāma Loka, which we first pass through after death before we can enjoy our rest. And in the third part, we will talk about Devachan, the period of rest between two lives and the birth process. So we're going to make quite a journey. Now, Theosophy teaches that we are more than just our bodies, because our body dies, falls apart at the end of each life. We see no continuity there. What are we then as human beings? Based on Theosophia, we are in essence an internal, boundless center of consciousness, also called a monad. Equally boundless in possibilities and qualities as the boundless source from which we originate as monads. As monads, as cores of consciousness, we have always been here, and we will always continue to exist. The monads are metaphorically described as sparks of eternity, in that sense that a monad is a spark of an eternally burning cosmic fire, or another metaphor is a ray from the eternal cosmic light, or a drop of the boundless ocean. And each monad expresses in its own unique way all the potentials of the monad during this eternal journey. And that is why you also see that beings differ from each other. It means we were not created by anything or anyone at our birth, and we do not disappear into nothingness, death. What we truly are is that deepest core, that monad that cannot be destroyed, not by disease, not by fire, not by an accident. And this applies not only to human monads, but in fact for the essence of all expressions of life. But then what do we regard as life? As Plato says, all manifestations of life are in essence this eternal, boundless nucleus or monad. And Plato, this Greek philosopher, also taught mankind that everything lives. And his definition of life was that something is alive if it is capable of setting itself in motion, if it can act, and also if it can be the subject of being set in motion by others, and therefore also react to that. Thus he says that beings are always in relationship with other beings. And that definition of life accounts for a cell, for an atom, a mineral, an animal, a plant, a star, a sun, or planet. But every manifestation of life is in essence this monad, as Theosophy teaches. And of course, all of them are in different stages of development, from primitively developed, such as a cellular organism, to more developed, such as a human being. Those differences only exist because each has developed a different part of his monad, a different part of their boundless core. But this life which expresses itself in all these forms of life, is this inner urge to progress, this urge to act and react, and also this urge to become the higher, the nobler, the more universal, more divine or spiritual within ourselves, to express that. And that urge that prompts us to act from within and to propel outward what lies within us. Now, Bound also discussed the egg diagram last week. First, we have the boundless, and from the boundless we see a stream or ray of consciousness, running from high to low or from within to without. And now follows a schematic representation of, well, it could be any organism, from a top monad, which originates from a supreme self, and that vertical line, that stream of consciousness, descends through different layers of consciousness, with different nodes marked at the transitions. And it's not the monads that are marked there, it is the phase of development in which those monads find themselves. Now let us walk through them from high to low. Now on the right side of the diagram we see the highest, called Atman, the inner God that expresses itself through the divine ego and clothes itself in a monadic envelope or auric egg. That is the form you will see on the left side of the diagram. And this monad has universal consciousness, with a reach, a scope of consciousness of a universe. And by that we mean the inner universe, not only the physical side of it, with the stars and planets that we perceive. Below that is Jivatman, expressing through the spiritual ego and clothing itself in the spiritual soul. And this consciousness has the reach of consciousness of the inner solar system. Below that is Bhutatman, expressing through the human ego and with the higher human soul as the vehicle. It has a range of consciousness that encompasses the entire planetary chain of the Earth, both the inner regions of the Earth as well as the outer realms. Next is Pranatman, expressing through the personal ego and clothing itself in the human soul. And that is who we are in our current phase of development. A special phase because from that moment we started thinking consciously, we also became self-conscious and therefore also able to reflect or resonate with the Supreme Self or Paramatma, albeit very vaguely. And this is indicated by the arrows in the diagram. Now our consciousness encompasses the sphere of the Earth. And below that is the beast ego, that is the instinctive animal consciousness. And finally, we have what we call the body. And this body encompasses both the physical and the astral or mother body. And that has a range of consciousness that does not extend much beyond the physical vehicle itself and the emotional spheres. Now also mentioned on the left side of the diagram are the Sanskrit names of the 7 principles, or characteristics of consciousness. They are indicated every time are the dominant characteristics that the ego expresses from this boundless monad. However, each layer is itself sevenfold. Each monad expresses 7 principles of consciousness: Atman, the divine; Buddhi, the enlightenment principle; Manas, the thinking faculty; Kama, desire; Prana, the life or vital principle; Linga Sharira, the astral or mother body; and 7th, Stula Sharira, the physical body. And also every ray from the monad, regardless of their development on the ladder of life, is built up, composed of these 7 principles. Now we return to the egg diagram. So we already said that all monads in those different areas are constructed in the same way, are all 7-fold beings, you could say. But they have a certain level of development, and they each express a number of those principles. And you see, if you look, for instance, at Pranatman as an example, circled here in yellow, that is us, the personal ego, that we express ourselves through the human soul, mainly through the principles of Manas, the mind, and of Kāma and Prana. And those abilities from the monad, from Pranatman, have already been activated, you could say. And that is who we are at this moment. We express these principles through our soul. And the reincarnating ego, the higher part of ourselves as personal ego, the expression of Pranatman, is not eternal. It lasts for the lifetime of this earth, this planet, which is 4,320,000,000 of years. And it periodically incarnates and is periodically active and can learn. And in between two lives, there is this period of rest, of recovery. And all the other egos in the diagram are also alternately active and at rest for longer or shorter periods. The spiritual ego, for example, with the scope of the inner solar system, also has his periodic re-embodiments throughout the entire existence of the solar system. But what matters is that the ego, therefore, is not something eternally static. It's constantly changing by activating what it essentially carries within itself in a latent state. And in doing so, by gaining experience with it in active life, it grows, it becomes more and more aware of what it carries within itself. In other words, every ego is an eternal, learning, growing being, continuously changing. And if we look at the big picture of this diagram, we also see monads within monads. Life that lives within the influence of higher or more developed life or monad. And every monad emanates the other monads. Just as one seed, from which, for example, a plant grows, which bears fruit and produces countless other seeds. So thus each monad emanates countless other living beings or child monads. For example, behind each atom of our bodies works one of those child monads. And our evolution consists of awakening all these seeds or child monads and bring them into activity. Now that monad does not descend into matter itself. It remains in its own divine realm. It only emanates a ray, actually countless of rays, with these child monads as the focal points, which, and by that I mean the rays, descend ever deeper into matter. And each child monad emanates other child monads, and so on, all being part of the one and same boundless stream of consciousness. Now all those focal points in the stream are overshadowed, inspired by the highest divine self. And the same one life is the source and flows through every being, in plants, in animals, in fact in everything that exists. And that is this highest self. And all monads are on an obligatory pilgrimage of eternal development. That means they are continuously unfolding their boundless abilities from the inside out. And together we form one large living organism, helping each other to realize this expression. Now we said that we are pranatma, thinkers, mainly, in our phase of development. And we contain all 7 principles, although manas, kāma, and prana are the most dominant. The thinking principle that is learning to master desire, kāma, and vitality, prana. And analogous to the 7 principles, we have the 7 aspects of thinking. And we can practice inspirational thinking, wisdom thinking, intellectual thinking, desire thinking, vitality thinking, emotional thinking, and physical thinking. And the students of our course, Universal Wisdom, have been able to train themselves to really distinguish between these. And sometimes when we are physically exercising, we identify with the physical part of ourselves. And sometimes we identify ourselves with the emotional part above it when we experience emotions or sensations such as fear or worry or sadness. And every time we are in that state, we strengthen our bond with those feelings. Some, you could say, become those feelings. And then we speak of an emotional person. And this applies to the other spheres of thinking as well. And we think, therefore, it's very worth examining your own thought life to realize what do you awaken, what do you activate, and therefore also what do you connect with. Are these characteristics that connect us to the imperishable part, or more with the perishable part within ourselves? But what is perishable and what is imperishable? And how do we define that? Well, when we die, the ray of consciousness withdraws from outer life. And it withdraws back into our monad. And as eternal monads, we then remain for some time in a more inner realm. So you could say that death is a journey in which our ascending consciousness moves from this outer material sphere to a more inner spiritual sphere. And our one-time body does die in this outer realm, but what we truly and eternally are is born again in the inner realms. And that is what we call death. Being born and dying is really nothing more than the cyclical unfolding and withdrawal of consciousness. The cyclical rolling out and rolling in. And dying is being born in a more inner realm, and being born is the reverse process when the consciousness from the inner realm expresses itself in the outer realm. Well, if dying is the withdrawal of consciousness in the inner spheres, being born is the descent or unfolding of that ray into matter. But with every rebirth, woven into the consciousness, are all the life lessons from the previous life. And the consciousness, what we truly are, will never cease to exist. The monad, our deepest core, exists continuously. That is, the continuity of consciousness. The ray of the monad only moves from the outer realm to the inner realm when we die. Okay, let's take a look at this dying process. When does it begin? Well, that is difficult to say. Sometimes it is truly a process that extends over a long period of time. At the end of an active life, an inner desire for peace arises. And you see that material things are losing their value. Things that used to be important, everyday annoyances, such as that troublesome neighbor or that slow internet, become unimportant. And on the other hand, there are moments when people want to talk about important things, events from their lives that have made a deep impression on them, that they want to share. But what is striking is that the external world with which they identify is getting smaller. People in the old age often only want people around them with whom they have a deep connection. And these are signs that dying begins from within, from the inner consciousness. They are signs that the focus of consciousness is beginning to shift from the outer world to the more inner realms. And this phase of the dying process can sometimes last weeks or months or even years before the actual death occurs. And then comes the moment when definite death occurs. Then that ray of consciousness withdraws from the outer realm and from the outer vehicle. We show you that our life before death determines our life after death. After death, we do not meet our Creator, but our own creations. Everything we have thought, felt, and done determines what we experience after death. And in that process of dying, which continues after the physical body has breathed its last breath, we are leaving the building blocks we have accumulated, the life atoms or child monads that we ourselves have emanated, and we leave them behind in the realm where they belong. Now all the transitory things that we have attracted in our active life, we let go again in death. For we can only enter the spiritual realm with the spiritual, the imperishable part that corresponds with that realm. So we will leave behind all our atoms, our cells that made up our bodies, our feelings, our personal desires and inclinations, our drives and lower thoughts in this dying process. These fall apart. These are disintegrating from our higher self, and they each go their own way. In other words, we do not take anything below the dotted line, as indicated in this diagram, with us as we continue our journey to Devachan, to the heavenly sphere between two incarnations. And at that moment, the higher thoughts, insights, visions, ideals, intuitions, and wisdom, and possibly also experiences of unity, are absorbed into the monad. We let go of impermanent things, but they do not dissolve or disappear forever. They continue to exist in their own corresponding realm. And when a person dies, and certain characteristics or qualities that have not reached maturity in this life remain in this physical, in this astral realm and the realm of desire as dormant seeds. And these dormant seeds we also call Skandhas. And this literally means bundles or groups of attributes that make each individual human being into the personality that he is. So seeds of causes that we have sown during our lifetime are coming back to us when we reincarnate. For instance, have you developed a desire in this life to learn to play the piano, but this desire has not borne fruit? This desire remains as a seed, as a skandha, a bundle of energy in the invisible parts of us. And those dormant seeds can, in the next life or subsequent lives, come to fruition or activity. They sleep within us until a time comes in the future, a karmically appropriate period arrives to awaken, to activate these seeds once again. So there's nothing that we ourselves have created, but have not yet processed, that can disappear. And this applies to the beautiful things, such as the desire to play the piano, but it also applies to all the other bundles of energy that we have built up in life, such as anger or envy or jealousy, etc. At birth, we draw our skandhas back to us, and they will form our new personality. And that is why in our next incarnation we will probably start more or less as the person we were at the end of this life. We even look roughly the same. We have the same character, the same tendencies, feelings, attractions, and habits. Although our sex may change in every few incarnations, spending a few lives as a man, then as a woman, all depending on our focus of the previous life. But it is emphatically not the case that we are exactly the same person in the new life as we were in the previous life, because we have learned lessons. We have grown seeds, and during that we have woven in the experiences in our character. and we are therefore able to reform everything in a new birth. So when the reincarnating ego incarnates again, it is like an architect who is able, through previous experience, to arrange the same living building blocks to build a better home this time. And thus, based on our growing insights, our consciousness will bring forth a slightly more perfect human being. And these are important thoughts to keep in mind as we resume our journey in more detail with what happens after death. We're going to look at the first phase in the dying process, and we'll discuss the first panoramic vision that we experience after death, and afterwards our stay in Kāma Loka. We have tried to represent this graphically so that we can interpret the entire process of dying and being born. So here you see a part of the cycle depicted with the different states or areas of consciousness. We see life as the stream of consciousness springing forth from the boundless. And we discussed that dying is nothing else than the withdrawal of this stream of consciousness, the withdrawal of the ray from the monad. Now in the dying process, this ray rises into the inner worlds of the earth. And at the end of the active life period, you see a star with death and the first panoramic vision labeled. So when death occurs, the last breath and heartbeat, the ego, the reincarnating ego, has a panoramic vision of the past life. It is the last moment of learning and by far the most important. In the first hours after death, our reincarnating ego, our learning part, sees before its inner eye, you could say a sort of film playing of the past life. We see all thoughts, actions, and events of the past life, even those we have not consciously registered, from the first moment that was registered by the inner memory to the last thought we had before we died. We see how we acted, what we have done, and also what we have left undone. And we see all that has happened in our past life, and also will recognize the justice of it all. And this process is called the panoramic vision. And we recognize ourselves at that moment as the creator of our own life, of our own joy and our own sorrow. And we see with crystal clarity the consequences our behavior has had for ourselves and for others. We see the connections between cause and effect. And from this panoramic vision, we can draw our final spiritual lessons from our past life. It is actually the most important learning moment of our life. Suppose that during our lives we were unable to learn lessons from what we experience, and this happens very often, then we can still learn our lesson from what we see in that panoramic vision. That is why this is such an important learning moment. Because the personal human being, that is we, in general thinks that we have just this one life. We therefore tend to look no further than our personality, the I, identifying just with this outer life. The personality we think we are is normally quite unaware of the fact that a real or spiritual force is working through us. It knows nothing of that learning soul or its spiritual part, or of his previous roles and incarnations on the stage of life. And this ignorance about who we really are has a major influence on the question of why do we learn so little in life. As individuals, we often tend to think that we are suffering because of something we do not deserve. For instance, when we become ill or are confronted with difficulties. Then we often sigh, that's just my luck. Unaware of karma, we call it bad luck, or think that a god or gods make us suffer. And that is why we call what we encounter in our lives often chance or coincidence or random. And we tend to blame others for what happens to us, or providence, or the workings of blind faith, or even God's will. And that is because we see no connection with the learning part of ourselves. However, if we are able to recognize the connection between our personality and the reincarnating learning part, then we will see the meaning of everything we experience. In our phase of development, we see this meaning, unfortunately, only after death, during that panoramic vision. The reincarnating ego, our higher learning growing part, sees with razor sharp clarity what the cause of our problems was, but also what the cause of our happiness was, and can draw intense lessons from this. And these are generally much more intense lessons than the lessons we learn during life. And it's those lessons that we can take with us to the next life. In the panoramic vision, we see this as a neutral observer, without any pain or emotions. And we see that our past life came about through our own actions, and how these actions also will lead to karmic consequences in our future life. In other words, the panoramic vision teaches us to understand logically why we have become ill, or why a relationship did not last, or why we have experienced great happiness. We know and see that we ourselves have been the karmic cause of our own happiness and our own sorrow in our past life. And what we must correct also in the future or learn to bring into harmony again. Now you might think, do I have to wait until I die to understand the meaning of life? To understand what is the cause of my problems? Or what is the cause of my happiness? Well, you don't have to. But it is not easy for the individual to learn such intense lessons during life. On average, we see few connections between the causes we establish and the consequences that result from them. But during our waking life, we can learn how to experience our panoramic vision as optimally as possible. How can we practice this? Well, we can become increasingly more conscious thinkers. And we can practice drawing life lessons by learning to look back on each day. And it's like having a small panorama at the end of your day, just before going to sleep. And you do this by looking at things from your highest insights as an observer and determine what you did well or what you failed to do. We just have to learn to look at ourselves from our highest perspective. And then we will not sigh anymore that we are still so imperfect, but will resolve to do certain things differently or better the next day. And that way you learn every day. You learn to take responsibility for your actions. And you also learn the impact your actions have on others. And we will increasingly see the connection between our actions and the reactions of our environment to our actions. And of course, it is of enormous help if you also recognize the law of cyclicity or reincarnation and the law of karma or cause and effect. If you test these laws, prove them for yourself, and can assume these laws, you will, of course, recognize cause and effect with much greater detail. And this is how you practice in consulting your own spiritual heart, so to speak, leading to the growth of your learning part, which ultimately, with practice, allows you even to consciously experience the processes after death. Whilst practicing the spiritual exercise during life has far-reaching consequences for your thought process, and thus also your growth process during life. You are literally building a bond with your reincarnating part, and you learn to draw valuable lessons already during the active life. And when we become active conscious thinkers like this, we don't have to learn the same lesson over and over again. And this also means that such an active conscious thinker who is accustomed to learning lessons during life will experience their panoramic visions much more clear. This panoramic vision takes place in the first hours after death. And we already explained why it is such an important learning moment. And that also means that we always advise to maintain peace and quiet in a room where someone is dying. Because emotional or personal feelings may disturb this panorama of the dying person, while they are actually in the process of moving on to the spiritual world. It's actually the same process as when someone wants to go to sleep. And imagine how difficult it is when others are at your bedside. It becomes then much more difficult for the dying person to detach themselves from the outer life. We're going to discuss the next phase, because after the panoramic vision, the dying process is not yet complete. When the ray of consciousness has definitely withdrawn from outer life, total unconsciousness follows. And we return to a vague kind of consciousness in the realm we call Kāma Loka. This is a sphere, a realm, that is somewhat more ethereal than our material realm. It literally means sphere of desire. And these are the lower realms of the cosmic life. It's sometimes also called the Hades, or the underworld. Now, what happens in Kāma Loka? It's there where we leave our personal feelings, our desires, and tendencies from our past life. So all non-spiritual matters, transient, material, personally oriented characteristics, these must be left behind during our dying process in this sphere. Because we cannot take them with us to the spiritual realm. And these include feelings such as anger, envy, selfishness, greed, indifference, or all kinds of sensations. We must also let go of material, external, ego-centered desires on this journey after death. And when we let go of these energies, they will form our skandhas. So that energy of feelings, desires, inclinations that we have built up during our lives, they will still linger in Kāma Loka until these energies have run out. Now, how do we let go of these things? We always do this by repeating, by living through them, reliving them, those thoughts, desires, and actions. And here too we see the principle that our life before death determines what we will experience after death. We can make our emotions and desires and everyday thoughts very strong during our lives. And we do this, for example, when, for instance, we have a heated argument with someone, when we are selfish, or when we strive fanatically to obtain something, and to achieve this, maybe do things that are not allowed. Now, these are all living forces that live on in our consciousness. So during life, we form these kinds of bundles or emotional and desire energies that turn into the skandhas. And we see many examples in the world of people who are controlled by this. For example, they have an insatiable urge for more, or more money, more prestige, more power. And their lives can be controlled by this. And it means that you also see that there are in fact practically as many areas or degrees in Kāma Loka as there are human beings, because no one is the same. Now you can compare that state to the following. If you have had, for instance, a serious argument one day, let's say with your manager or your colleague, then you must first detach yourself from it before going to sleep at night. And if we don't do this, we won't be able to fall asleep, because those thoughts will keep running through our head. And if we do fall asleep, we might have a nightmare. I think everyone will recognize this. Now, this is what happens in Kāma Loka as well. If you haven't been greatly troubled by personal feelings and desires during your past life, then your stay in Kāma Loka will be short, a kind of fake dream. But if you have had many strong emotions and personal desires, then the period in Kāma Loka will last longer and even can feel like a nightmare. So during our lives, we can live in such a way that we have a short Kāma Loka. If we are compassionate during our lives, emphatic, unselfish, helpful, lenient in our judgment, righteous, just, forgiving, if our life has had these characteristics, in other words, if we have actively lived that way, then we will pass through Kāma Loka almost as if asleep. So good selfless people may stay here just for a few weeks or months and experience it as a vague dream. But if people have been very gross or selfish in their past life, it can sometimes take even more years than a human lifetime. So you see, death is the world of consequences. And after death, we are confronted with the consequences that result from our own thoughts and actions. We encounter only ourselves, our own creations, nothing strange. And maybe it's good to note that these experiences are more dreamlike. So we just talked about, a time period like weeks or months, but actually the one experiencing it will not have a clock or experience this as months or years, because it's just this dream that the person is experiencing. Now, when we have let go of the non-spiritual in Kāma Loka, the so-called second death takes place. And that is the final separation of our higher and lower parts. We have detached ourselves from earthly matters, and when this has happened at the end of Kāma Loka, then the ray of consciousness withdraws further inward, where we can continue our journey. And during the second panoramic vision, our highest self sees not only the meaning and justice of the past life and how it came about, but we also see the connections between all our previous lives. We can see this partly in the first panorama, but in the first panorama we hadn't not yet let go of the lower elements of our life in Kāma Loka, and they prevent us from seeing all our previous lives in the spiritual life. But that happens in this second panoramic vision. Good, in this final part we will talk about Devachan and the new birth. So after the second panoramic vision, our higher human part goes to rest, to recover in what we call Devachan, the subjective heavenly sphere. Devachan is not a place, somewhere in the universe. It's not heaven, but it is a state of consciousness, a blissful dream state of happiness, of peace, of tranquility, in which we rest between two lives. We are absorbed into the heart of the monad and continue our pilgrimage of the monad through the cosmos, through the inner universe. But then comes disappointment for most people, because at that moment we fall asleep in this dream state we call Devachan. Now, why do we fall asleep? Because as human souls, we are not yet trained, have not yet developed the senses to be awake in those higher realms that the monad peregrinates through. We are still training to awaken ourselves as lower human souls, by connecting ourselves more and more with the reincarnating part, so that finally we can remain self-aware, can remain self-conscious even in these inner realms. So Devachan is therefore a dream state. A state of consciousness where we can develop our spiritual ideals and spiritual aspirations from our past life. And consider it the most vivid dream state. More real than our outer life, but yet illusory. Now, how can we imagine Devachan? It's very difficult to imagine because we do not know, we cannot compare it with anything during our present life. Because during our lives as personal human beings, we continuously have this personality that is distracting us. For example, when we are on vacation, the thought suddenly occurs to us that we have to go back to work in 2 weeks. Now that is the influence of the lower man, the personality. But in Devachan we left that personal human behind us in the dying process. We dwell in Devachan stripped of our personality. So stripped of all the worry, all the fears, all the sadness, or other earthly matters. There's no envy, no fierce competition. There's not even a clock telling you what time you have to be somewhere. So what does our Devachan look like? It is said by those who are ahead of us, think of the most beautiful, the most perfect, the happiest moment of your life. Devachan is such a moment, but 1,000 times more intense and longer. In Devachan we fulfill the ideals that we cherished on earth, but which did not come to fruition. For instance, the music lover, who during his lifetime practiced playing or composing the most beautiful music, plays or composes the most beautiful music in Devachan. The nature lover, who is committed to protecting nature, finds himself in the most beautiful, unspoiled nature. He feels absorbed in it, is completely one with it. And the Theosophist, whose heart lies in learning to understand and study Theosophy better and better, but doesn't have enough time for it, will finally study and ponder all those books from his bookshelf in Devachan. And the selfless father or mother lives harmoniously among all family members. And they see that they are all happy and that all their ideals come true, without family quarrels, without money worries or parenting problems, which are part of the earthly life. So in short, Devachan is an illusory world, a spiritual dream world. And everyone dreams their own aspirations and ideals surrounded by their projected loved ones. And how long we stay in Devachan also depends on many things. However, there's one rule. The more spirituality and universal ideals you build up during your life, the longer your Devachan will last, because you will have a lot to work out. You will then have many spiritual lessons to weave into your consciousness. And the less spirituality you have built up during your life, the vaguer your Devachan is and the faster you will reincarnate. But there's one exception to the rule. Some very selfless, compassionate, and spiritual people who have a desire to devote their lives to serving humanity, they could actually have a long Devachan, but instead they incarnate relatively quickly. Because during their lives they do not develop a desire for a certain result, but they build up an inner desire to actively and continuously help their fellow human beings move forward here in this outer world. And as a result of this desire, they stay in Devachan only for a short time and reincarnate more quickly because they are drawn exactly to the sphere where they can be of help. The question people often ask is is it possible to have contact with someone in Devachan? Or can someone in Devachan contact us? Well, it's not the case that the deceased looks back from Devachan at the life and the people he has left behind. That would be almost cruel and anything but comforting. Because everything moves on and you are just standing by on the sidelines. And that is not very pleasant or good for your peace of mind. So that's not how Devachan is described either. It's a dream state of consciousness, of peace, tranquility, and harmony, which leads to recovery. But please note, it is true that our true, selfless love can reach the one in Devachan. Our selfless, highest spiritual form of love can even increase and deepen the peace and tranquility of the one in Devachan. And the reverse is also possible. We too could experience the influences of someone in Devachan in our lives, provided we succeed in lifting ourselves above our transient part to our higher spiritual part. And people sometimes experience this too. It is then described as a temporary, deep feeling of oneness with the other person. And that bond is spiritually divine in nature and can unite. And it is the unbreakable bond of selfless love between people. That spiritually divine bond which is not lost between two lives. But then we are talking about a high, selfless form of love, which is certainly not commonplace. Now, Devachan, like Kāma Loka, is a world of consequences. What we have built up during life is worked out there. So we do not learn new lessons in Devachan, we only encounter ourselves. And there comes a moment in Devachan when we have woven in or assimilated all the lessons of the past life into our consciousness. We recovered from the past life, we have rested, and an inner urge arises to reincarnate ourselves. We began the evening, this lecture, with a remark that there is this inner urge within us, the driving force that wants to bring out the greater possibilities that lie within us. And we want to broaden our horizons, we want to move forward. And karma, together with this desire, also makes us leave Devachan to be reborn. And we enter the next cycle of life. Death, we said, is the rolling up of our consciousness into an inner part of ourselves, and the letting go of external matters which bundle together into skandhas. And birth is the reverse process. It is the unfolding of consciousness. And then we leave the spiritual realms of Devachan to reincarnate ourselves in this material realm. So that which we actually are at our deepest core, our consciousness, returns, as it were, through the same gate back to outer life. In an outer life, we want to take on new tasks and responsibilities. We're going to pick up where we have left off. And in order to do this, we must rebuild a transitory part of ourselves to work in again. And in that descent, the reincarnating consciousness picks up all its old living building blocks, its life atoms, and its skandhas, the bundles of attributes. And we retrieve what we have let go at the end of the previous life during the dying process. And when we speak of a new birth, we speak of a descent or an unfolding of consciousness. But in reality, consciousness radiates, as it were, forces and energies which form a sphere of influence. And within that sphere of influence, all living building blocks, life atoms, are attracted or activated, life atoms that belong precisely to our sphere of influence. And we retrieve our desires, inclinations, and outwardly directed thoughts when we return through Kāma Loka again. And in the emotional realm or astral realm of the earth, we retrieve our personal feelings. And finally, we gather our physical atoms again, which we left behind in the physical realm at the time of death. After which, the physical birth can take place. And all those transitory elements which formed our transient vehicular nature in the past life are attracted again in the new life. And as the director of our birth process, the reincarnating human being activates those smaller beings or building blocks with whom they already collaborated in previous lives. He draws them back into his sphere of influence like a magnet. They are awakened within our sphere of influence, and they help in the new life to build up the vehicular nature. So birth is therefore a familiar continuation from our previous life. And contrary to popular belief, the birth process is directed by the reincarnating human being themselves. The human being who is about to be born only needs a parent in the final phase of this birth process, when the physical part has to be built up. And the parents are in fact the last physical gateway for the consciousness of the reincarnating human being returning to this outer world. So you see that there are a lot of invisible steps before the physical birth process takes place. The reincarnating human being who awakens in Devachan, prepares to be born, sees just before initiating the birth process a third and final panoramic vision. And this consists of him seeing a very clear preview of the life that lies ahead of him. And so we see an intense vision also of our future life and the justice of everything that will come our way. Then the ray of consciousness descends from the spiritual realm to the lowest physical material realm, where physical birth ultimately takes place. And you see the circle is complete. So you will understand that that baby in the cradle is not a newly created soul and not a blank slate. It is a reincarnating soul returning. A reincarnating soul that is about to take a new step on a long evolutionary path of inner growth toward ever greater perfection. So in conclusion, are we immortal? Well, not in the sense that we live on unchanged and eternally as human beings just as we are now. On the contrary, we see change, we see movement, we see development everywhere. We, as monads, migrate eternally, from life to death and back again. But the continuity of consciousness is no more broken in death than it is during sleep. And this means that everything evolves, unfolds what lies within it, bringing this into manifestation. And that is the path to improvement. But we are, of course, mortal in our form, which falls apart. Continuity of consciousness is the law or the foundation in the universe. The deepest core of man, the essence of our being, that human monad, that is immortal. And it has now developed into the human state of evolution, but that is only one phase of growth in our evolution. And we have already passed through many lower stages of evolution, from mineral consciousness, through plant consciousness, animal consciousness, to human consciousness. And when we have fully developed our humanity, we will die as humans and are reborn as nascent gods. And then we will go through the divine phase of evolution. But throughout all that time, there is this continuity of consciousness, this continuity of being. And at the end of this great period of evolution, we are, if we do our best, fully developed gods, at home in the universe. But of course, in the boundless, it does not stop there. We are literally a continuity of consciousness, an eternal pilgrim, experiencing periods of rest, both small and large. Now, what good does it do to know all this? Well, we believe it can have a profoundly beneficial influence. Because how we view death, in a world where YOLO, you only live once, just thinking about your own life and happiness seems to be the most important thing, is very determined for your life. And if we know that everything of value, that all insights and wisdom are not lost at death, and that after death we only encounter ourselves, that our deepest core is never lost, and in the next life we simply pick up where we have left off, with everyone we love now, that this idea can take away a lot of fear and worry, and also might have a very great impact on society. And we can practice these ideas already now, in how we ultimately we can remain self-conscious in the spiritual realms after death and experience these processes consciously. And this begins with practicing how you can learn to recognize the permanent and temporary within yourself. And next week's speaker, Henk Bezemer, will talk to us about this. Okay, now we will have a short 3-minute break, and then the possibility to answer some questions you might have. You can ask these via the chat in YouTube or via sending your questions to questions@blavatskyhouse.org. And after that, we will continue with our private Zoom study. You can still send an email to info@blavatskyhouse.org if you want to join the study, and you will then receive the Zoom link. Okay, see you in 3 minutes. Hi, Jenny. Are there questions?
Yes, there are two questions, but I will ask them both at the same time. They are both about Skandhas.
Okay.
You told quite a lot about it, but there's still a question if Skandhas are the same as Kāma Loka and how that relates to each other.
Yeah. Well, Kāma Loka is a state and a sphere we are actually going through after we die. And in that Kāma Loka sphere, we actually leave behind certain lower tendencies of our personality, which are on the plane of the, well, you could say personal, more selfish desires, feelings, etc. But if we have had a certain habit, if we tend to get angry quickly before because of something, that habit is like a bundle of energy or attributes that is also left behind in Kāma Loka. So Kāma Loka is the state and the place, you could say, where we leave behind those skandhas. And so the skandhas are these bundles of attributes, and Kāma Loka is the state. And when we return, so when our consciousness returns and is going to incarnate, we are going to incarnate ourselves, or actually at that time, incarnate literally means taking up a body of flesh again, but it's actually just before we are born in a physical body, we are going back again through this Kāma Loka sphere, and then we re-attract these skandhas, these bundles of energy. So just a simple example, let's say you like to collect stamps. So you're so much into collecting stamps, this is also a habit more on a personal level. It's not really, it's more neutral. It's not a really bad habit, but it doesn't do any damage to anybody. And of course, you can imagine that if you reincarnate, and sometimes this might take even thousands of years, so the completely different world, society, etc., you won't have any stamps anymore, probably, in next life. But there still will be this habit of wanting to collect things. Or maybe you will collect shells, whatever. And so this habit, that is part of the skandhas that will return to you when you, well, take up again this new personality before you are born in the next life. I hope this makes things clear.
I think so, yes.
And if not, please send your questions to our email address.
Yes. And there's other questions also about skandhas. Is there a difference between skandhas and life atoms? And if so, what is the difference?
Well, life atoms are actually what we call the living building blocks. It's the consciousness that is behind our physical atoms, our physical cells. And that's what we call in theosophical literature, life atoms. And you could say that we, with our habits, I gave these examples before, are actually impressing these habits also on these life atoms. And so these life atoms are not there only on a physical level, but also on more ethereal levels. So we also have astral life atoms. They are composing our astral bodies, our linga sharira. And so actually these are connected. So these skandhas are also part, you could say, part of the character of the life atoms that we impressed on them, because they are still in a very, you could say, initial phase of their development, these life atoms, these consciousnesses, where they are just copying exactly what higher consciousnesses like we are impressing on them. So in that way, there is also a connection. And it also means it's not, I mean, if you reason from reincarnation and karma, there is nothing accidental. There is no coincidence. There is no chance. So even the form of our body and the capabilities of our bodies are based on how we treated our bodies or our life atoms in a previous life. It means, it can influence how healthy we are. And of course, this is not something that happens from life to life. Sometimes these things can skip a life, or it's from longer ago, from maybe multiple lives ago, and then you get the consequence in this life. But there's nothing coincidental. It's all what we can do right now. Yeah.
Nice, thank you. And there's one question more about Devachan. If I am longing very much to have intercourse and study with my teacher, and will I have then also all those teachings during Devachan that I can learn a lot?
Well, like we try to explain, Devachan is a dream state. So if you were very much into studying with your teacher, and in such a way that you haven't realized the complete end of it, there's still this higher desire to study, and there's still a lot more you want to study. In your Devachan, you will have this projection. So it will not be your teacher, but it will be the image that you build of your teacher, and you two together study. But it's your image, your dream, so it won't influence your teacher. However, what we try to say is that there's one exception, and that is love. And love is something that penetrates all. So, but that means it's only the most universal expression of love. So if there is this, and love in essence is a bonding thing, you could say it works like it's magnetizing, it attracts people together, it draws people together. So this really universal form of love you might have for a teacher might be a connection. But it's not that you have contact with your teacher, it's only this universal love that is like a blissful blessing energy that can reach your teacher. But it's not this personal link. I hope that makes it a bit more clear.
And you can't learn more teachings during Devachan?
No, because Devachan, thank you, Jenny, is a state of consequences. So there is no contact, it's only a dream state. And it means you're only integrating the lessons that you have learned during the active life, but it's a rest period. It's a passive period. So you won't take up any new lessons. You can't, in your dream, you might feel you learn new lessons, but it's not really new lessons. Yeah.
Okay, that were the questions.
Okay, thank you. Then we wait for a few seconds, then we go back to our Zoom study. And thank you for asking the questions. We always end with the Gayatri. And of course, I can recommend everyone to sign up again for next week, where Henk will talk about the distinction between the permanent and the temporary part of ourselves. So I think very much in line. So we hope to see you all next week. The Gayatri. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.